Hi, this is Peter Teuscher. I'm here with Tobi Demker. Thanks for joining us for another podcast where we talk about personal and professional development and a little bit of philosophy. We pick a topic and see where the conversation takes us. And today you have a great topic for us, Tobi. What have you got?
Yeah. So I thought we'll be emotional. We'll talk about emotions and more about the like owning one's emotion and how you can utilize that in a different way. The reason why I picked the topic is I'm sort of updating my coaching certificate that I have to do every 3 years or so, and in this process, I've been rediscovering the importance and the enormous benefit of, exploring your. We talked about intuition before, but owning the emotions and exploring the emotions that you are feeling. And I find it really interesting and really useful in coaching to share that. Like, so if we're having a conversation and it's about I get a feeling that something's going on, or there's something that you're not telling me, or something like that, and I can share that, and we can start a discussion around what I am feeling. Usually I think that's a really powerful sort of thing to do, and you can explore a lot of, and maybe open a lot of self-awareness around that for the coachee.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really. Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Finish.
no, and the other part of it is that for years in workshops, I and we, the people that I work with, we've been talking about the importance of I feedback and how we can utilize that. And what that really means is that if you give feedback to someone else, you start with what you're feeling and what the consequences is for you yourself, and not so the focus is not on the person you're giving feedback to. It's what's happening to you, and then inviting the other person to explore that with you. And it's a really non-threatening way to share what's going on, because it's your feelings. And that's what I mean by owning one's emotions, that it's not that I'm attacking you, or I'm not, it's no act of aggression or assertiveness or something. It's just about exploring, this is what I feel, I own it. It's no judging in it. So that's why it's really powerful. And it's something that I really want to develop further, so I can use it in more situations. And I guess that's why I want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Slightly selfish. Yeah.
No, I think it's very useful for a lot of people, both in business and private. I think what you're talking about there also ties into, the work of Marshall Rosenberg with his nonviolent communication. He talks about making those I statements, and when you do this, I feel this, rather than attacking someone and saying, you always make me feel this way. Well, this concept that other people have so much control over you that they even control your emotions. People often don't look at it that way, but other people only control you when you give them control, right? When you allow them to control, and that's not always easy. There's, especially when you're married. I'm sure there are times when your wife pushes your buttons and triggers this emotional response, and vice versa, probably. And I know in my relationship the same, but also, in the workplace and so on, it all kinds of things can happen, and I think it's important. We often give other people responsibility for how we feel, right? Yeah. And that's giving them way too much control. And often we don't think about it. We see ourselves as a victim of the other person's behavior, and instead what can we control? We can regulate, although it's not easy to do, but you can. There are ways and means to try and regulate your emotions. Obviously, that's something that we develop as we get older. Kids don't have that kind of emotional a regulatory system that we develop as we get older. So yeah, it's time to make use of that. We're all adults, right? But sometimes we fall back into that childhood mode of having a temper tantrum or something like that.
Yeah, and that's also natural. I mean, we do that because it's a way for, I think we've talked about this before, but it's a way for us to protect ourselves when we feel threatened. So it's a natural response to a thing. But yeah, when you have that notion, and I really like that, what you're saying about, if who's controlling your emotions, or who's responsible for how you are feeling. And then when you get that notion, okay, well, how can I look at this? And I really like that picture of imagining your emotions as sort of a ball that you have in front of you. And you can look at it, and you can sort of look at it from different perspectives. And what does it look like from above or from underneath, and just by that, okay, so what's actually going on there? And then you invite yourself and maybe others to a discussion. Oh, well, what is this? Well, what is this about? But that's very easy to say. When you, as you said, if my wife triggers my buttons, I'll react on autopilot, and then I might have a response that I don't want to have.
Yeah, it triggers patterns of behavior that are often, they're strategies from another point in life. We all have strategies that we developed at a young age that we sometimes still try to apply, even if they don't no longer work. They might have worked once, and then we kept applying them, even though the results weren't what we wanted. And I think, as we always talk about, the first step there is just awareness. And once you can recognize that pattern in yourself, it becomes easier to stop it before it, escalates and gets out of control. Often we reflect and we go, oh, why did I act that way? I don't know why, what overcame me and whatever. But usually it's just an old pattern of behavior that became, that basically was initiated through some emotional response that was triggered from the situation. So they're not, once they get going, it's just like once you're in the middle of anger, it's hard to stop it, right? But when you can see it building up and see it coming, then it becomes a little bit easier before it builds momentum. Yeah. I think the thing that I wanted to ask you about and see your thoughts on defining what emotions are to you, like. Because I have a very clear idea of it, and I'd be interested. I mean, I can share my thoughts if you want to, or do you have sort of a clearly defined? How do you define emotions versus like what you feel? Like, is it just a feeling, or how do you see emotions?
It's a really good question. I haven't thought about a definition of what emotions are for me, but however, that's why I think this is so interesting, and the way that, okay, emotions have a really big impact on us as human beings, and they are in many ways not controlling us, but just sort of steering us in all of our behaviors and thoughts, etc. So, and that's why I think the idea about owning the emotions, it's so interesting. And like, if you own them, well, then you can. It's about you, and it's not about anything else, and that gives me it gives me a sense of power and control and proactivity and authenticity. It's a really sort of powerful idea that, okay, it's my emotions, it's nothing else, and I can do what I want with them, so I can explore them, I can react on them, I can choose not to react on them. Yeah, I don't have a definition, but I like that idea. It's very intriguing.
Separating yourself, so you creating some distance between your awareness and the emotion. So it's not you're not the emotion. It's just a part of you. Well, the way I look at it, and I've given this a lot of thought, is that we have the body has we have sensation, we have feelings, right? What we call feelings. And a lot of people consider emotions and feelings to be synonymous. They think they're the same thing. And I in the process, I think there's a progression, because when you have a pain in your foot, that's not an emotion, right? We wouldn't call that an emotion. So for me, the feelings we have are is a sort of an inner guidance system. It's the signals we get from within. So in the same way that we may get a sense of pleasure or pain from our physical feelings, we get the same kind of sensations from from our intuition or sort of the unconscious telling us, this is a good thing, this is a bad thing. And in my view, our emotions are a response to a feeling, right? So we have a feeling and then we respond to that feeling. So, and the way this becomes really obvious to me is you'll have someone who is in this, two people in the same situation, and they'll experience fear, right? And one person will get really angry, one will maybe withdraw or run away, they'll have a particular, there are people who laugh at fear, there are people who get angry at fear, there are people who cry, all from the same situation, right? So that invokes a feeling in you, and then your response to that feeling is the emotion. That's the way I define it for myself. I see it as a response to a feeling, and so I find giving it a series. So you have an event, you have a feeling that you get, and then you have the emotional response. And for me, that makes it a little bit easier to break it down and, as you say, own your emotion, take control of it, because you don't need to respond the same way every time, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think this is, Joe Dispenza talks about these practiced emotions that we have. When a certain situation happens, we have disgust, we have distress, we have, there's a situation and we have a strategy for it. Like for some people, when they face adversity, it makes them more determined. Other people, they get depressed, right? So both of those things, depression certainly has a lot of emotions tied to it, but even that sense of determination and fortitude, that's kind of an emotional response in itself, right? But both kind of leading from a situation that has a feeling, and how we respond to that feeling is for me the emotional the emotional response. That's how I look at it.
Okay. So the emotion is kind of the interface between the feeling and the response.
Well, the emotion is the response to the feeling. So the feeling is just, it's like a communication. Let's say you and I both get the same bad news. And, maybe I go silent and you get really excited, like agitated, right? So we both gotten the same communication, but we responded differently to it. And so that the response to that news we got, that communication we got, that's the emotional response to me. Look, this isn't based on any psychological theory. It's just the way I've worked it out for myself in my philosophy. I've broken it down in a way that helps me better to reflect on myself and to recognize the patterns and where they come from. So does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's very much related to I think we talked about that before as well, the power of choice, and you have a stimulus, you have a response, and you have an outcome. But if you have a little bit more awareness of how you respond to the stimulus, then you can steer the outcome in different ways, and that's where it's an enormous power in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And thinking about, we can define it in different ways, but yeah, that part, but that these are your emotions, and you own them, so you can do what you want with it. Of course, it depends a little bit what kind of state you are in, but when you feel like you have the energy and you have time to ask that question, why am I having this emotion? Why am I feeling like this? And I can think of numerous examples when I feel something's going on in the back of my head. I feel a little bit uncomfortable, and very often I don't react on it. I don't think about it. But if I take the time to ask myself, what's going on here? What's making me feel this slight discomfort? And I realize, it's this thing that is triggering something in me. And then if I have time to process that, well, this is not important, then it just goes away. But it's, in most cases, I think we don't take the time to realize what's happening with us. So to be really sensitive to these kind of triggers that's going on, it's such a cool feeling when you can actually do it, and you can then choose your outcome, or the emotion just goes away because it's false. It might be completely false.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
you're getting an emotion of something that is not even true. You might have some kind of fear, but then you're like, oh, this is not important to me right now, and then it just dissolves. It's incredible.
Yeah, and often the emotional response isn't helpful, right?
Mm,
And because you can't argue with feelings, you feel the way you feel,
mm,
but the emotional response isn't necessarily the right one. I mean, there are people who there something small goes wrong and they fly off the handle, and that's not helpful for them or the people around them. It's not productive. It gets them in a very agitated, excited state that's negative.
mm,
And whereas and in that state, so it kind of escalates the problem rather than that bringing it down and making it more manageable.
mm,
So I think there are elevated emotions that can be really positive. I mean, if you feel really joyful, really happy, obviously there's no need to manage that down. Although, if you're feeling that way at a funeral, probably you want to manage the emotion there. But it might not be appropriate for the people around you.
mm,
But for the most part, it's our negative emotions that we're trying to get a handle on, because number one, I think to ask yourself, is this good for me to have this kind of an emotional response? Because for some people, it's a strategy. They feel like if they don't get angry, if they don't express their anger in a highly emotional way, then other people will take advantage of you, or other
mm,
people will see you as weaker or whatever.
mm,
And that's an interpretation, and that's a strategy that people use. But often, anger it doesn't get you. It doesn't help you more. Diplomacy and knowing how to communicate what you really need, and that's often far more productive. So I think it's an important question to ask yourself as part of that whole owning your emotions. Is this emotion productive? And then the other piece is recognizing that you have more control of your emotions than you think. In the same way that people think, people when I talk about meditation with people,
mm,
I can't stop the thoughts; they just come. Well, that's
mm,
true. You
mhm,
can't,
mm,
just like you can't stop the feelings; they come, but
mm,
you can control what you want to focus on. And in
mm,
this case, when feelings come, if you have a level of awareness that shows you what's, a lot of times I recognize this feeling,
mm,
and my response is normally this, but this time I'm going to try and go this way. In the same way, when we try and meditate, thoughts come and I see these thoughts coming and it's going to only lead to a spiral, then I'm going to focus on some of these other thoughts that I have. And so
mm,
we have control of our focus, and in the same way with our emotions, we can focus on other options, right? Other
mm,
options for responding to the way we feel. And
mm,
again, this is why for me that breaking it down between feelings and emotions is so helpful, because
mm,
the feeling is always legitimate. You can't argue with someone's feelings, right?
exactly. Yeah.
And not, nor should you disregard your own feelings. It's
Mm,
the most important communication we get. It's the most important, it's just as avoiding those the feelings behind the emotions is the same as ignoring a pain in your abdomen or in your leg and just going,
mm,
okay, it'll go away on its own. Maybe it will,
mm,
or maybe you really need medical attention, right?
mm,
So that's why I think being aware that you can, a lot of people will say, oh, that's just the way I am, right?
mhm.
And I've even met people in North America. The Italians don't tell me this, but I've had people in North America go, yeah, it's the way I am. I'm Italian, and it's just this idea about Italian culture that is not really relevant for. I mean, there are. Maybe in some countries the culture is you get more excitable or and so on, but it's not one to one with the way North Americans see their heritage. It's funny, but they it's almost like they adopt this persona or this way of responding to the way they feel because of certain cultural norms or expectations that they have. This is the way you should respond, and this is kind of why I wanted to mention Joe Dispenza, because he's written a book. He's written a lot of books, but the one of the most recent ones I read was Changing the Habit of Being Yourself, and he talks about these habits of emotional response, which actually become they become part of. So your body, will produce adrenaline and so on to prepare for this emotional reaction that you have to a feeling. and it's kind of something that we've practiced. And so he'll say, okay, well, it's here's the news, and so my practice response to it is, this outrage and so on. Or, yeah, well, it's this time of day where I start to feel, now it's time for me to be depressed or excited or, whatever. And so it's interesting how we internalize a lot of our emotional responses. We have a situation A, it creates this feeling, and then we respond with this emotion. And we don't even think about it. And I think the whole process of what you mentioned, this is why I thought the topic was so interesting to me, this whole idea of owning your emotions. If you're owning your emotions, that means taking responsibility and recognizing that you have some degree of control over it. At least that's the way I interpret your that term anyway.
Yeah, sure. That's complete. I think it's completely it. But you can utilize it in so many different ways. And I think that's also why it's so powerful, because sure, we're talking about how we can, if we're owning our emotions and creating awareness about it and choosing the way we respond, yes, it's a very powerful thing. And, it's about asking that question, where is this feeling coming from? What's happening with me? And then deciding, is this something that is real? Is it not real? Is it something that I want to act on, that I don't want to act on? When you have the opportunity to do that, or when you're able to manage that, I think it's a wonderful, sort of really powerful kind of feeling. But the other part of it is also in these, and we started talking about NVC and how we if we want to get, if we're in a conflict, or say that I want to give some feedback to you and I'm a bit afraid of how you're going to take it. If I put that on myself and I'm owning these emotions, it's become so productive and constructive, because it's not like I'm judging you. I'm not telling you anything that you're doing good or bad. It's no judgment in it. It's not really about you. It's how I feel, and that I'm inviting you to sort of be a part of that, because obviously if we were having some kind of working relationship or whatever it is, we might want to work on it. And if we're doing that in a really constructive way, I mean, I can be really annoyed with you or something, but if I'm sharing my emotions of I feel a bit frustrated when with what you're doing or something, it's not about the point is not what you're doing. The point is my feelings, and then it becomes a different focus on the conversation, and it becomes so much more constructive. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And that's why I think the process of nonviolent communication is an important one. I think the whole concept of words of violence has kind of gotten out of control, because there's a big difference between being punched in the face and someone saying you're an idiot. It can be, one's more physical, one's obviously more emotional, but I think this whole idea that it's more important to focus on this idea of that other people are not responsible for how you feel. So when you talk about, when you do this is how it makes me feel. And so there's two parties involved here. The other person could say, well, not my problem. Or if they want to find some kind of harmony in the relationship, or ability to cooperate in a more positive way, they'll go, oh, I didn't realize that was evoking that in you. And so, what can I do differently? Right. And so it becomes then an exchange of, okay, we both care about how the other person feels, because we know, for whatever reason, either you love that other person or you want to be able to work with that other person, and it's not productive for both of you to always be on edge. So there are different motivations for it. But at the end of the day, it doesn't make for a positive work environment, doesn't make for a positive home environment if you're constantly doing things. And we all know, I'm sure you see it in your kids, but there are times when people get in a state where they like to get under your skin. They want to provoke something. And so in those cases, that's counterproductive and it's annoying. I don't think it's violence. That's just my opinion. But, again, that's my perception of the world. And there are people who probably are more sensitive and would see it that way. So I think that it's a real opportunity, I think, is what you're proposing is a real opportunity to be able to take more control of it. And also, if there's someone you have no control over who keeps saying things that are causing strong emotions in you, then it's up to you to find strategies for how do I deal with this, right? You can try and silence that person. You can try and have those, but it's there's no guarantee. I mean, stranger off the street says something that's offensive to you. Are you going to call the cops on them? Are you going to put your life through a bunch of turmoil just because, or are you going to find a way to work through it and, and be more, self-directed in life and less externally motivated and far more motivated by your inner signals and finding your own truth, right?
Yeah. I think one way to create more awareness around that is, usually we're talking about labeling is not a good thing, but I think when it comes to emotions, like to be able to label your emotions. So what is this? What's going on right here? I find that really interesting in workshops or in any kind of activities that I do with professionals. Typically, you do an activity or you have a discussion, and then if you ask the question, well, how do you feel? I would say that about 85-90% the answer is something that has nothing to do with their emotion or their feeling. We're not used to talk about it, our feelings and emotion. It's really difficult to put words on it, right? So and then you have to dig deeper. So what are you feeling? And then very typically they start saying something else, but that's not the feeling, right? So what is the emotion? How would you label it? And then you really have to start and think, well, yeah, what's going on inside me? I don't know. Well, I'm feeling maybe worried or anxious or excited or whatever it might be. But to practice that, how do you label that emotion? And then, okay, well, what do I want to do then? Oh, I actually feel anxious. I wonder where that's coming from, It's a really good first step to create some awareness about, okay, what's going on? And then starting to deal with it. So, labeling your emotions.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because we're always, people are often very reactive to what they feel, right?
We are. I mean, we're human beings, right? So.
Nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying, if you want to be more empowered, if you want to be more self-directed, because otherwise you'll be constantly responding to the outside world and how it makes you feel. And I mean, that's part of the human experience is, doing things and seeing how they make you feel, right? And seeing what the experience is like. But if, there's a lot of negativity out there. And so I try to minimize the news I watch now. And I try to, I minimize the amount of violence I see on it's not like I don't own a TV, but you still can watch movies and stuff on your screen, and I avoid the amount of
nobody watches TV anymore.
No, I know. I guess it's for over 60-year-olds. I don't know, but no, there are still people who do. But regardless how you entertain yourself, but I think I limit the exposure to the amount of violence I see, just because I don't think it's for me personally, it's not something healthy. It doesn't make me feel good, and people love scary movies. I don't love them. So it's about knowing what you can handle, right? And knowing that there are ways to control that. And so, if you from an entertainment perspective, maybe that stuff excites you, maybe that, creates emotions that you like. It doesn't for me. So in those kind of ways, not only can you, so that's the part you can control about your outside world, the input that you're getting that creates certain responses. But the rest is really, how do I manage the inner process? Because I find a lot of people, they feel victimized by the outside world and by what other people do to them and how it makes them feel, right? And often people are victimized. They were a victim at the time, and they carry that with them, and they remain a victim. And the thing is, when you identify as a victim, it's not very empowering. How empowered do you feel to change? How empowered do you feel to make a difference in your life when you label yourself or you see yourself as a victim? And so that's why this owning your emotions is also such a great thing, because it empowers you to say, yeah, actually, I don't need to let this stuff bother me. I can take control of it. Or this stuff is out of hand. I've felt these feelings since I was a kid, and I'm going to learn to work with them, and I'm going to shift my focus, and it's going to allow me to feel new emotions. And I think when you can get on that track and on that it's the growth mindset.
Yeah.
I'm not always going to have to be this way. I can change, and that is really empowering. That's really liberating as well for people if they can get out of that mindset. Now, mind you, I know that we get in different states, and it's about recognizing, am I in a state that I can actually deal with this right now? Because sometimes you just feel overwhelmed, and it's not the time to say, okay, now I'm going to empower myself, take control of the situation. You're not going to be very successful. So in those moments when you're in a good state, and you know you can decide, and you can have those moments of clarity, that's the time to practice. And then other times, well, you're just going to get you're going to get emotional. It'll pass, and you'll move on. And then next time you have that opportunity, hopefully you'll be in a better state to choose differently, or to start taking on some new strategies on how to deal with how you're feeling.
Yeah. And isn't that a really inspiring idea? I
think
that.
so.
I love that idea, and what you're mentioning about empowering, like that. It's just thinking about your own personal development. Well, who's in charge? What's going to happen to you? Well, it's about me, and it's such a powerful step to start working on those choices. Well, I'm in a situation now. How am I going to deal with it? I'm going to go and run away, or I'm going to work on it, or I'm going to complain about it, or am I going to, I don't know, find a solution, or I'm going to have a conversation with another person, whatever it is. But when you get into that state that I'm owning my emotions, and thereby I take my own choices and commitments based on that, we put ourselves in a very different situation.
Yeah. And, for the majority of cases, I think all of this stuff will work. I think there are some exceptions. Obviously, when you're feeling overwhelmed by your emotions, then it's time to get help. I mean, especially we're living in a time when, mental health is really, a lot of people are struggling with mental health, and there's an epidemic of depression and so on. If you don't feel like you're up to doing this alone, you don't have to. I mean, therapy is thankfully no longer a bad word, or doesn't. I mean, I remember when I first started exploring or considering the idea of therapy, in my mind, it still had a stigma of, a mental illness, it means I'm on the verge of insanity or something like that. I had these all kinds of really erroneous beliefs and thoughts about what it meant to need therapy and so on. And most people really benefit from it. So there's that side of it if you're really overwhelmed. And then if you're in a situation where you're being bullied, or when there's a mob after you, I think those are times, that's really difficult to deal with. So that's it. I think it's totally legitimate to feel a lot of feelings like, overwhelmed by your emotions. And in those cases too, it's time to get help. It's time to reach out to someone and get some support. So I think for the most part, I think for our day-to-day, how we're dealing with our interpersonal relationships, how we're dealing with things in the workplace, I think a lot of people are in a position to manage that whole process themselves. If you feel like you just can't handle it, then by all means, get some kind of support, reach out to someone, because I think it only gets worse if you kind of suffer in silence. I know that from experience.
Yeah, a very, very important point, of course. On that note, I think it's also really important to realize, when you're having emotions that are making you, well, say grief, like by owning the grief, you're also, you might feel like you're consumed by it, but it's a very important signal about how you're dealing with the situation. And I think the ability to feel grief or sadness or unhappiness, but being able to label it, I know what this is. For me, it's a real comfort in that. I mean, thankfully I don't feel like I'm in a situation very often where I'm in a very prolonged state of grief or sadness or something. But when I am, I can find it like a relief to feel like, really feel sad right now. Like it means that I feel something. It makes me feel alive. We can't be like super happy, positive all the time, right?
No, and you know how much of a proponent of happiness I am, and but it doesn't mean there's this expectation you should be, the ideal Instagram life every minute of the day, always smiling, always happy. No, that's not realistic, and that's not even what we want. I mean, life is a roller coaster. It is ups and downs, and as long as it's within certain parameters, I mean, when it starts to hit extremes, then then I think it's time to reflect. But definitely, I think the contrast that we experience in life is what makes it such a full experience. If it was just this monotone, I'm always happy, or I'm always kind of just okay, or I'm always sad. None of those three are really very satisfactory. I think a range of emotions. There's a reason we have them, right? There's a reason we have this because it's a feedback mechanism, right? So.
Yeah, and it's part of being human. I mean,
Yeah.
to be able to feel that those those emotions that we consider not being positive, I guess. But
Hmm.
there can be some kind of, I don't know if it's fulfillment or almost joy in those tears as well.
Yeah.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. So I wanted to come back to something you were saying before about, we're not used to expressing our emotions, right? Asking people
mm,
how they feel, and they have
mm,
kind of a standard response. Oh, I'm doing good. I'm doing good.
mm,
I'm okay. Yeah,
mm,
or I'm doing great. But you're right. If you dig a little, people have trouble talking about the way they feel and about the way they feel, and this has a wide range of implications. So, I think this is the reason people often don't trust their intuition, because there's this kind of I guess there's this unconscious belief about, well, you can't just trust your feelings, right? I mean, or people will sometimes even say you can't just, you have to think about it logically. You can't just trust your gut. So, we have that stigma on, emotions are, like we say, it's this broad band, and so how can you rely on it? Because it depends on the state you're in, and so on. So I think again, I come back to it's not necessarily that you can't trust how you feel. It's we're not very practiced in it, right? We're
mm,
not very practiced in reflecting on how we feel, and so we don't even know how to interpret it, to describe it. How do we even put it into words? And not every emotion can be put into words. That's why we have, the part of the brain that processes feelings and the part of the brain that processes language are the two separate parts of the brain. So I mean that right there, there's a disconnect and a difficulty in kind of translating it. But
mm,
it's good to encourage people to create metaphors and tell me what it feels like, right? And creating kind of a picture rather than trying to. This is why a lot of, I think, spiritual and religious texts are very metaphorical, because they're trying to put words to something that's really difficult to describe. And I think
mm,
your feelings are the same. So that's the one side of it. On the other side, there are people who do like to talk about their emotions, and they like to talk about them ad nauseum. Like they'll talk about their problems and so on. And at first it feels good, but then it becomes this habit of almost complaining or
mm,
creating this negative loop that continues and continues, and there's no solution. It's just focusing on the problem. And there was an interesting book that I read. I think I've brought him up before, but Ethan Kross, he wrote a book called Chatter, and it's all about the negative thinking that we have. Because everybody
mm,
has that mental voice,
yeah.
and he referred to a study that was done where they looked at people who there was a major event, and I can't remember if it was 9/11 or some other tragic event. And basically, they looked at these two groups, and one was encouraged to really talk about their feelings and what they were going through a lot, and the
Mm,
other, were not. And it was the people that continuously talked about this thing over and over again, they felt worse. They
mm,
actually had a worse emotional state from prolonged discussion about how they were feeling. So
mm,
my recommendation is always, and again, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not qualified to give any kind of psychological advice,
mm,
but my strategy, you can, getting it off your chest once, maybe even
mm,
twice, that's really healthy. Beyond that, it's just complaining, or it's just ruminating aloud, right? And I think that is not healthy. Not when you do it internally, and not when you do it externally. And so, being able to release, how you feel and talk to someone you trust, and really be able to express yourself, really healthy. Talking about the same thing. I was thinking about this our last podcast. I feel like I bring up a previous relationship a number of times because I learned so much from that experience. But for me, if I wonder, okay, do I, if I bring up something, because if I have an experience in my life, and there has been a few where I continued to talk about I was asked, and I continued to tell the whole story, and you tell a story over and over, and it becomes part of your identity, and that's not healthy, right? So I think there's a distinction between, definitely, if you're feeling something, find someone you trust to talk to about it, especially someone who's neutral, who's going to, that's why a counselor or therapist is so helpful, or a coach as well. If you're not trying to overcome trauma or something, any of those people, or a good friend who's going to be neutral, and it's just going to listen rather than go, trying to make you feel better by, that guy's an idiot, or you're better than that. No, just listen, just be, just let someone release what they're feeling. I think that's really helpful. But getting in a habit of, every time you see someone, to share all of your life's problems with them and repeat them over and over and over, that's going to make you a negative person, and it's not going to make you feel any better.
Yeah, good point. I guess, that's more about getting stuck in some kind of emotion, and that's not what we want, right? To get stuck on it, and that you talked before about that this emotion becomes you, right? And that's what we're not trying to do. By owning the emotion, we're kind of separating ourselves from the emotion. I own it, but I can choose what I want to do with it.
Yeah.
So if you're in a state of constant complaining about a certain situation, well, at some point, hopefully you can, if you're owning that emotion, you can realize, okay, I feel like this. Well, what do I want to do about it? And if your constant response is the same, well, like what you're saying, well, I'm going to talk about it, I'm going to complain about it. If you keep doing that over and over and nothing changes, well, maybe it's time to think about a different kind of response to it. Right?
Exactly, and this where I go back to this, making it a part of your identity. That's kind of an excuse for living out a certain emotion, and that's not productive. That the reason you're making an excuse for it, because it's not helpful. I get angry, but it's whatever. It's whatever cultural background you come from, or if you just different kind of stereotypes that we have about different cultures, and then you adopt that as your identity. That's not productive, right? Where if you can recognize, this is an emotional response that I have the ability to respond differently. I own that, but also this is why I love your point about, like this, we distance ourselves. If we can distance ourselves from the emotion and reflect on it and go, like when you talked about it, like this is ball of energy, because that's what emotions are. They are this energy that builds up inside you. And I think that's such a helpful way of looking at it. And it creates the ability to change, right? Which is what we want to do as coaches.
Yeah, well, and as an individual, you always, at least I think most people, want to grow and develop, and
of course,
learn new things and have new experiences, maybe new emotions. That's a very interesting part of life.
Yeah, good point. Because people who get in a funk, or they get in I find especially people as they get older, they just get. And this goes back to Joe Dispenza's point. You get this habitual way of being, and these are the range of emotions I feel. Kids have this broad spectrum of emotions, right? And they live all of them, and within seconds they're switching from one to another, and that's great. But then it's almost like as we get older, we sort of, this is our practiced range of emotions, and this is my emotion for this situation, this is my emotion for this situation, and it's almost like, well, it's all very, very predictable, right? And so. Recognizing that it doesn't have to be is really helpful, empowering and liberating. I think there's no doubt about it. And look, I there's been so many times when I've had a certain response to a situation, and I go, huh, why do I always go down that road? And then but rather than asking why, it's taking a look at, okay, where do I go wrong? At what point do I lose control? And what point do I have control? And then trying to practice a new pattern of behavior. And I think, like changing habits is not easy, right? And then when you see emotions that you have frequently as a habit, that'll sort of give you a hint of what you need to do. It's about practicing new emotions.
Yeah, and creating awareness around them. Yeah, and one way, I guess, is putting, for me at least, to be able to label them. What is the emotion that I'm feeling right now? I think that's really, really helpful.
Yeah, giving them names can be helpful, because it identifies it. Because that's why feelings are really hard to describe, but emotions, we can label them because we can relate them to certain situations when they arise and so on, and they create a certain mood. So I think you're right. And then you can ask yourself, do I need to be angry or sad, or do I need to feel the way I'm feeling emotionally? Do I need to have this emotional response right now? And then you can start to recognize, well, it's not out of my control, and I can feel differently. And I think I'm repeating myself now, but I think it's such an empowering message.
Yeah. I guess that's really, I really feel like I feel a bit empowered just by talking about this. It's one of those topics that makes you feel like, I'm in charge of my own situation, and I think it's really just an inspiring idea to think of. Now we acknowledge that this is not easy to do.
No.
But if we practice it more, maybe it will make us, I don't know if it's happier or more fulfilled or whatever it is, but it's probably something positive.
Yeah, I've been on my own personal development journey for a better part of 25 years, in terms of consciously like reading books and meditating and doing all kinds of things to become more aware, to improve who I am. And I still struggle, and I still have days when it's not easy. I have changed a lot of habits. I have more to change. But, with every step that I take, I get closer to where I want to be. And so it's kind of, somebody asked me once, someone said to me once, since I've known you, you've been working on yourself, and with the kind of the unspoken question being, when are you going to be finished, right? And I'm never going to be finished. It's an ongoing journey through life of improvement. So
when will you become perfect?
Well, there's no such thing. And so I think, there's definitely being patient with yourself is really important. So, but it's worth trying. It's worth trying because every step improves your life, and it improves your stability, because when you learn to take control of those negative emotions, it leaves space for so much more positivity, more of those good feelings that you really want and thrive for. And a lot of times, they're pushed to the side by the fear-based kind of practice negative emotions that we have. And so if you can find ways to, keep those under wraps or get more control of them in the situations where they're not appropriate or where they're not beneficial to you. Like you say, the grieving process, that's a beneficial process. It's very normal. But when you're constantly feeling depressed, feeling angry, feeling anxious, those are the emotions that don't help you. They really can be detrimental in many ways. And so when you learn ways to take control of those and shift over to something else, whether it's a new perspective, new way of looking at things, but saying and consciously saying to yourself, no, that I don't need to feel this way. I can feel this way, and then there's just mental strategies that you use in order to make that shift. So yeah, that's super helpful.
Yeah, I guess a bigger arena. I like that idea too that you're mentioning, like giving yourself a better arena to choose what you want to focus on. like if you're consumed by these negative thoughts and emotions all the time, and that's taking up your space. Like your your arena to choose what you want to work on or what you want to focus on becomes so much more narrow. But then, there's actually a range of things that I can choose to do here. That looks interesting. Let's do that instead. Okay.
Yeah, I can choose to respond differently. Just like you can choose behaviors, you can choose your emotions, and I think a lot of people don't feel like they can choose. It's such a instant reaction. But I like the way I like the way that Eckhart Tolle talks about mindfulness, and he talks about looking for those gaps between the thoughts, right? So. And as you become aware of the gaps between the thoughts that you're having, because sometimes it doesn't seem like there's ever a gap, there's so many, but as you become more mindful and more aware, you start to recognize little gaps between your thoughts. And I think the same is true of when you start to recognize the gap between, what you're feeling and your emotional response to it, a thought that you're having an emotional response to it. When you can recognize the little gaps, that's your moment to act. That's your moment of power. And the more you practice it, the more you'll recognize the gaps and the more you'll be aware of the opportunities to change. Because without that awareness, everything just seems instantaneous to you, right? But the more you become mindful of it, the more you're able to, find that crossroads and choose differently. And yeah, like we just said, it takes practice and it takes time and it's not easy, but that's the opportunity for change when you can find those little gaps.
Yeah, I think we kind of said the same thing in various ways a few times. It's so I think so much about what we talk about is sort of encapsulated in this idea, that this is it's such a catalyst for change and personal development and well-being and so many things. So it's
it's all interconnected, I find, and
for sure.
Look, I don't think anybody is perfect at it, so it bears repeating. And I think to talk about it again and again, I listen to I don't often read the same books over and over, but I certainly listen to talks or I listen to audiobooks and stuff. And sometimes the message, I think this is why people who are religious read the Bible again and again, because it just keeps hitting home the same message. It's repetitive, but it just anchors them to their faith. And I think the same goes for, and I don't think either of us are super religious people, but I think the same goes for these ideas, these fundamentals. You repeat them because it takes practice and it takes reminders, and we live a busy life, and it's hard to come back. And I do it all the time. I'm like, I know this stuff. I should. That's a word I try and I encourage other people not to use. And here I find it creeping into my vocabulary again. But again, just things that we try to practice and remind ourselves of. So if we're repetitive, I don't mind, because I think they're just good reminders. I think it bears repeating, and it's worth hearing again and again until you get good at it.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting to think about that when you, because I might have seen a certain model, or I've explored an idea that I looked at it 10 years ago, and then I look at it again, and it means something very different to me, and I guess it's related to this whole idea about experience-based learning, that you get different kind of experiences, and you get new perspectives, and you see the same thing in a very different light, and you have a very different understanding of what it means to you. And I really find that about this message, that I think recently I've sort of rediscovered. Wow, the power of it. So yeah, maybe that's it as well. Well, it also says that whatever we think we understand, just by sort of looking at something or studying something, we think we understand it. But if you look at it again a few years later, it might be a really different thing. I think that's really interesting as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why we give workshops, right? I think you can teach someone a theory through books, but I think in the workshops we give people the experience. And then the same thing is, you can know something theoretically, but until you really experience it in your life and put it into action, you won't really understand it until you, and then again, that's a feeling and emotional thing, right? So you feel it, and you create some emotion, then you get that inner feedback on whether you're on the right track.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, look, that sounds like a good place to leave it. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, awesome. So, look, if no one else has benefited, I certainly have.
Yeah.
I think you would be. But anyway, hopefully those listening have found some inspiration, had some good reminders as well, and are going to find ways to step back from being a victim of their emotions and learn to sort of be empowered and take control and navigate their lives and become more autonomous and
Own,
self-determined. So.
yeah. Owning the emotions.
Yeah, owning the emotions. That's it.
Truly owning them.
Yeah, fantastic, fantastic. And if you have trouble, don't feel free to get some help. Search for some support. All right. Okay, we'll leave you with that. We hope we've been some support to you, and and we'll speak to you next time with another new idea that we want to explore in our conversation. All right. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks,
Thanks, Toby.
Thanks.
Cheers.